Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer, and today's video is another in our series entitled Winning the Offer Battle Without Losing the War. Today's practice that we are focusing upon is buyer's choice not to include an inspection contingency in buyer's offer. Obviously, buyer is motivated to eliminate the inspection contingency by a desire to make buyer's offer more attractive to seller. There is enormous risk associated with this practice. In another video, we talked about the risks associated with not including a financing contingency. And the risks to that approach is that buyer may forfeit their earnest money. The risk to buyer not including an inspection contingency is that buyer may go from thinking that they are purchasing the home of their dreams to find that they have in fact purchased the house of horrors. And they are now not just losing or forfeiting their earnest money, but they are saddled with a home that is riddled with dry rot, ceiling tiles that are falling in on them because of water damage, potato bugs falling on their heads when they sleep at night. And I'm not making up these facts. These facts come from a case that the Court of Appeals decided in 2013. In that case, the buyers actually purchased a house that would be more costly to repair than it would be to demolish the entire house and rebuild it. Now, I'm not focusing on that particular case today because that case doesn't fit the facts that we're describing, but I'm just using that house itself to illustrate the fact that a buyer may purchase a piece of property believing that the house is in a certain condition only to discover after closing that the house is in a very, very different condition. And if you're the broker who put that transaction together without buyer first having an inspection performed on the property, then let me assure you that yours and your buyer's actions will fall far outside of historical norms for our industry. While I understand that in today's marketplace, many buyers are purchasing without including an inspection contingency, in the big scheme of things in our industry, that's extremely unusual. So, as I have said often in this series, buyer brokers document your transaction file. If your buyer chooses to make an offer to purchase seller's property without including an inspection contingency, make sure you have explained to your buyers the risks associated with purchasing property and not first conducting an inspection contingency. Not first conducting an inspection, and that buyer has accepted that risk and voluntarily, in fact, instructed you not to include an inspection contingency in the transaction. A really good way of doing that is to require the buyer to sign the Form 35 Inspection Contingency Addendum with a check mark by the box, the very last box on that form, which is a waiver of the inspection contingency. If you have a buyer who's choosing to make an offer without an inspection contingency, make sure that at a minimum you have documented their choice to do that by marking the box on that form, having the buyer sign that form, and including the Form 35 in buyer's offer. It would be very wise to have an additional documentation in your transaction file expressing to the buyer the risks associated with purchasing without first conducting an inspection of seller's property. Now let's move to a related topic that many buyer brokers seem to be just in error about. And that is the question of whether a buyer who does not include an inspection contingency still has the right to conduct what buyer brokers sometimes refer to as information-only inspections. Let me assure you, there is no such thing in our statewide form system that allows for an information-only inspection. Understand that buyer has absolutely no right to access seller's home with an inspector or otherwise, once they've entered a purchase and sale agreement, without seller's permission. So buyer does not have a right to bring an inspector through seller's home simply because buyer has entered a purchase and sale agreement with seller. Buyer has a right to bring an inspector through seller's home only if seller gives permission. And a savvy seller or a seller with a savvy listing broker is unlikely to grant permission to a buyer to conduct an information-only inspection. Why? Because frankly, seller does not want to risk exposure to information that buyer's inspector may find that may diminish seller's proceeds in the current transaction or impact negatively seller's ability to sell the property to a future buyer should this buyer not close the transaction. So the savvy seller who has entered a purchase and sale agreement with a buyer, not including an inspection contingency, is unlikely to allow buyer to conduct an information-only inspection. If that is true in your transaction and your buyer doesn't include an inspection contingency in their transaction, then buyer brokers understand that buyer will purchase seller's property without having any form of inspection and without any knowledge of the true condition of seller's property. Buyer brokers, before you let your buyers do that, you need to put in writing your advice to buyer to seek legal counsel. Because not only may buyer be saddling themselves with a house of horrors, but they may be impacting their ability to successfully seek a claim of fraudulent concealment or misrepresentation against the seller after closing. Maybe seller has not disclosed conditions about the property of which seller has knowledge. But in that case, it's at least conceivable that a court will find that the seller has no liability if buyer failed to conduct all due diligence, including the very industry normal procedure of conducting an inspection of the property prior to closing. I'm going to summarize this video by saying there are enormous and numerous risks associated with a buyer agreeing to purchase seller's property and waiving all rights to conduct an inspection. Brokers, before you do that, advise your clients of the risks. Make sure that the buyer who does that signs the Form 35 waiving the inspection contingency, and buyer brokers put in writing and keep a copy for your transaction file advice to your buyer that the buyer seek legal counsel before making an offer without including an inspection contingency. If you have questions on that topic or any other, please send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.